Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm your host, Samantha Reigle. I've spent more than 20 years as a mediator helping people resolve conflict, but here on this podcast, I talk about why conflict and even distress show up at all and how changing the way we respond can just make life a whole lot easier. Gosh, over the past month or so, I have felt shocked and honestly disgusted by the levels of depravity surfacing in our news cycles lately. And even though a part of me wants to turn away to not sit in that kind of energy, I know that this is something we also probably should talk about because this isn't just disturbing content. I believe we are witnessing major fractures in our society. So, in spiritual language, this is what's often called a dark night of the soul, a period where the stories that once made life feel coherent collapse, where what you trusted no longer holds, and clarity doesn't arrive as like peace and calmness, but as a reckoning. And what we're experiencing right now, it kind of feels like that collectively, because when a fracture gets this large, it's usually not coming from out of nowhere. It's never usually sudden. It's usually coming from the result of long stretches of collective inattention, of not looking too closely, not responding to earlier warning signs, and not changing course when the signals were not as loud. So eventually life does what it always does when it's been ignored for too long. It will force attention. It says, if you won't look willingly, I'll make it impossible not to. What's new, I think, is what's happening right now with the news cycle and all the stories coming out, is that we are no longer able to not look. It's so in our faces. What we are seeing right now isn't the birth of something dark. It's the collapse of our ability to look away from what's been there all along. What happened in Minneapolis with ICE is a perfect example of that fracture becoming visible in real time. We watched federal immigration agents shoot and kill during enforcement operations, so-called enforcement operations. And what many people watched with their own eyes, it didn't feel like order in any sense of the word, like law and order. It didn't feel safe. It felt like we were watching murder. And then what happened after that, it's almost like a second injury, because almost immediately we were told by Trump and those at the highest levels of law enforcement not to trust what we saw with our own eyes, our own perception. That what we saw in all those different angles wasn't what it appeared to be. Explanation about what it wasn't arrived before any accountability. So there was a narrative before there was a reckoning. For many people in this country, especially people of color, especially people living near poverty, this isn't shocking. What we saw happen in Minneapolis with these two individuals who were shot and killed by immigration agents wasn't shocking to some portion of our society because it's been happening all along. If you've asked these people of color that live near poverty, if you ask them whether they've seen law enforcement gun down unarmed citizens, many could tell you that they have. This has lived in their bodies for generations. It just didn't live in everyone else's awareness. So what's different now is who is being seen. Now it's the white ICU nurse or the mom of a young boy. Now it's someone or people that we would describe as gentle. So the violence didn't change. This has always happened, but the visibility did. What used to live in places some people could choose not to look at is now in the center frame of all of our news feeds, social media algorithms. You can't look away now. So when violence crosses that invisible line, when it touches people, the dominant story unconsciously codes as safe, relatable, one of us, the spell starts to break. So we're watching that spell break, and we're seeing the same pattern unfold with the Epstein files, another major news story that's circulating right now. We've known about Epstein. I think originally he was first arrested in the early 2000s. And we've also known about other powerful abusers for decades. We've known about priests molesting children. We've known about institutions quietly protecting predators. None of this is new. But what's new is that the proximity is no longer deniable. The release of the millions of pages of Epstein-related records isn't just exposing one man, it's revealing a web, a proximity network, a social ecosystem that touched politics, academia, celebrities, media, tech, law, even spiritual spaces. And this has all survived for years. So let me say this carefully because it matters. Being named in a document in the Epstein files is not the same as being guilty. Proximity is not automatically participation, but proximity still means something. It tells us what circles existed, what access existed, what behavior was joked about, what was tolerated, what people chose not to disrupt because doing so would have cost them status, money, or belonging. When you place that next to what we watched happen in Minneapolis with ICE, the theme becomes impossible to miss. This isn't about isolated bad actors. It's about systems that learned how to absorb harm without stopping. As long as that harm stayed in places society had agreed not to see, right? Not my child or child of my family and friends, so I don't have to look at it. Not my community, not me. I was born here or came here legally, so I don't have to look at abuse and murder, right? That's how it's excused. What's different now is the role of the visibility. Okay? The algorithms are shoving this into all of our faces. We don't need mainstream media to validate it. We have footage, we have documents, we have creators and ordinary people refusing to stay quiet. That doesn't mean everything circulating is true. We still have to use our own discernment. But it does mean the old strategy of distance is failing. And that's why this moment feels so heavy. So on this show, I talk about conflict as a portal, not something to fix or smooth over, but something that reveals misalignment and forces a choice. A portal is a choice point. It's the moment where you realize you can't keep standing in the same room, repeating the same loop and expecting different experiences. You either stay where you are, continuing to explain, justify, normalize, and numb yourself, or you step through the doorway and begin responding from a different perspective. And stepping through doesn't mean you suddenly know what comes next. It means you stop pretending nothing is happening. That's why the choice point shows up before anything else, before opinions, before solutions, before action plans. Because once you override what you sensed, once you explain it away too quickly, that doorway closes. You're back in the room, doing what you've always done. So the choice point is here, early, before we do anything else. Do we override what we sensed, or do we stay in the discomfort long enough to see what it's actually revealing? And once reality feels this exposed, once what you've already seen can't be explained away, something different happens. You go still. It's more like an elephant sitting down on us. So with Minneapolis, there's nothing abstract left to the debate. What happened is visible. The justifications don't soothe anything. They don't even really convince. They just land on a body that already knows something crossed a line. And with Epstein, it's the same feeling, just stretched. The scale is so pervasive, the proximity so widespread that the mind almost refuses to move. Politics, wealth, celebrity, tech, media, spirituality, all touched, all aware enough to joke, to tolerate, to look the other way. At some point, the horror stops being shocking and starts being paralyzing. And that's the part people don't talk about. When depravity becomes this obvious, the nervous system doesn't activate, it freezes. Not because we don't care, but because the implications are too big to metabolize all at once, right? I mean, you can feel it in the body, the heaviness in the chest, the lack of urgency, the strange quiet, like where you're like, what the fuck am I supposed to do with all this? Okay? It might feel like it's confusion, but you're actually in a state of being in the state of being in recognition, if that makes sense. It's the moment where the story that maybe this was the exception collapses. And what's left is the unbearable realization that this is how much we've been shaped, manipulated, conditioned, and how long we participated without fully seeing what was going on. Because it was all hidden, even though in some ways there were signs that this was all happening. So when you don't know what to do with something that big, you don't move, you go numb. And I would say the numbness isn't apathy. It's the system saying, I can't act yet, I have to see, right? That frozen space where nothing needs to be argued anymore, where the obvious has landed, but meaning hasn't formed yet. That's the doorway opening. That's the portal. And that's what I think we're all standing there looking at. And the only way forward is to notice the pattern underneath what you're seeing. Not to fix it, not to solve it, but to recognize it. Here's the pattern that I see. Not just what's happening with ICE, not just in Epstein, but everywhere systems start to fail because we see them for what they are. It starts with a belief loop. If something is sanctioned by authority, we assume it's justified. With ICE in Minneapolis, the belief loop sounds like it was enforcement of illegal immigration. They were authorized. The victims got in the way, right? In the Epstein story, the belief loop sounds like he had money, he had connections, he must be untouchable. And for a long time, the system behaved as if that were true. Enough that trafficking of minors could persist. People still hung around him after he was convicted of facilitating abuse of girls as young as 14. And now we're learning about babies, 9-year-olds. Okay. So then comes the behavior loop. After the belief loop, you have the behavior that follows what your beliefs are. Escalation replaces relationship. Procedure replaces judgment. Responsibility disperses. With ICE in Minneapolis, we see force arrive quickly, and we see official secrecy and controlled messaging that keeps the public at a distance. With Epstein files, we see something different but related, a culture of access and protection, PR, lawyers, social networks that can turn this disturbing content into this is handled. Okay? So once we have the belief loop, the behavior loop, then there's the perception loop. The one that makes people feel like they're losing their grip on reality. Language goes abstract. This is just an incident. This is an operation. This is use of force. Allegations, rumors, just by association. And the point isn't that those words are always wrong. The point is what abstraction does. It creates distance, and distance makes outcomes tolerable that would normally be intolerable when you're up close. Because when you're too close to denial becomes a language of choice. So this is the part that makes people feel powerless. And I want to stay here for a minute because a lot of what I'm describing isn't necessarily intellectual, it's physiological. When I say I feel like there's an elephant on my chest, I mean that strange heaviness where you're not crying, you're not panicking, you're just compressed. Like your body is trying to brace for something it can't name. And the mind starts bargaining. Maybe this is complicated. Maybe I don't have enough information. Maybe this is just how the world works. And that bargaining is a clue. It's the psyche trying to preserve a world where the guardrails are real, because the alternative is terrifying. The standards are selective, consequences are uneven, the reality can be contested by whoever has the loudest megaphone. And right now, it's not just one story, it's a stacking effect with all these stories stacking one right after another. And what happened in Minneapolis, that shows like a visible edge of the state power and the speed of the narrative control. The Epstein files shows the long-term invisibility of exploitation and proximity to wealth and influence, and how high society can become a shield. So when these fractures start stacking, denial becomes harder to maintain. And when denial finally breaks, people don't feel empowered, they feel exposed, because exposure doesn't just reveal what's wrong out there, it reveals what we've been participating in because we weren't fully looking at what was happening. And that realization strips away the distance that made things tolerable for all of us. I kind of want to bring this concept down to a room I usually sit in as a mediator, because this is the same dynamic. So I'll talk generally. I've been in many mediations where two people are sitting across the table from each other, both technically, within their own versions of the truth and justifying their positions. And in one of those rooms, one person keeps repeating, "We're in compliance. We're following procedures." They're calm, they're confident, they're reassuring. And when I usually hear a party talk like this, my stomach drops a little, not because it's untrue, but because compliance is being used as a shield against responsibility for how the other person has been impacted. As if following the rules meant they no longer had to reckon with impact. The other person in the conflict in these scenarios, or some version of it, aren't arguing the facts. They aren't raising their voice. They're actually trying not to cry, not to look too emotional, because they want to stay credible. They're not trying to win. They're trying to be seen as human. And sitting there, it becomes so obvious to me. If this continues, someone's going to get hurt. Not because anyone's trying to be mean. Everybody's being well behaved. But something essential is already gone. Relationship, accountability, the willingness to let the human costs actually matter. And that's the moment I'm pointing to, because it's the same moment we're standing in right now. So by the time everyone sees it for what it is and agrees something's wrong, unfortunately, the damage is already done. And that's why I think this doorway, this portal that we're all standing in with this news cycle and all these stories coming out, why it feels so intense right now. These aren't isolated events. What's happening with ICE and Epstein, these not isolated at all. But like I said, the distance that used to protect us from fully registering them is collapsing. We all know that depravity lived behind curtains and sealed records and whispered rumors, but the distance is gone. All these fractures in our society, they're in our faces on repeat. So, I think this breakdown in old monopoly on old narratives and what we're seeing now it's an opportunity for all of us to decide if we're no longer going to tolerate it. We're just standing on the edge of a reality that we can't unknow and don't know quite yet how to respond. So I think it might be helpful to, let's talk about responses that we could have. I'm not saying like these are going to be solutions or fixes or strategies that promise outcomes, but responses we can kind of experiment with if we're serious about walking through this portal and not going back to how we were. Look, the truth of it all is that most of our default responses are already familiar. We change who we vote for, we write Congress, we post, we argue, or we stick our head in the sand and try to live our lives as none of this is happening. And I want to be clear, none of those responses are wrong. Some of them have yielded results in the past, and some of them still matter. But they're also the responses we reach for inside the same perceptual framework that produced the fracture in the first place. They're responses that assume the system is basically sound and just mismanaged. That if we apply enough pressure, vote the right people in, shout loudly enough, or wait it out long enough, things will course correct back into something maybe familiar. What this moment seems to be asking for is something maybe more disruptive than that. It's asking what happens when we stop responding inside the old familiar story. So instead of prescribing what to do, I want to offer a few response experiments, ways of behaving, perceiving, and creating differently, each with kind of trade-offs. So you can look at these and say, let me try this out and see if it works for you. The first experiment where you could try responding in a different way would maybe be withdrawing unconscious consent. So this is about noticing where you're still deferring to authority or narrative, even through your body knows that something crossed the line. So, okay, example, in Minneapolis with ICE, it's the moment you felt tempted to let explanation override what you saw. And then with Epstein, it's the moment the scale feels so overwhelming that you collapse into a course of this is just how it is, and then you disengage. So withdrawing unconscious consent, that means that you're not doing either of those, not explaining it away and not numbing it out. Just refusing to participate in the agreement that says, if this is normalized, I don't have to change how I relate to it. And the trade-off is going to be losing certainty, but the gain is staying in integrity with what you already sensed. Okay. Another response that you can experiment with is refusing abstraction. Instead of arguing at the level of ideology or sides, you stay close to the human cost. You say names of the people who were killed or the people who are victimized. You notice impact. You resist language that turns harm into theory. This doesn't make you louder. It makes you harder to dismiss. The trade-off is that you're going to lose adrenaline of outrage. And without that adrenaline, things can feel a little bit more lonely and slower. Another response that you could experiment with when you're confronted with these types of stories that are happening in the world is create from a different reference point. And what I mean by that is that this is what happens after you've seen too much and to keep pretending. With the example with ICE in Minneapolis, it might look like no longer organizing your thinking around whether an action is authorized and instead asking whether it's humane. And then with Epstein, it might look like no longer measuring credibility by proximity to power, titles, wealth, or influence, and instead notice who is willing to look away, joke, or stay silent when it was convenient for them. One of the people that I wanted to bring up was Bill Gates' wife, Melinda. She had said, it's been out now that his association with Epstein is one of the reasons why she got divorced. But when you apply this type of response, she could have went to the FBI right away with what she knew. Yeah, divorce the man, but also report what's happening. And I bet she would have been taken seriously. So when you create from a different reference point, it means that your choices are going to stop being guided by what the system validates and start being guided by what you can live with. The trade-off is going to be visibility and approval. And the shift is that you're going to stop feeding a reality you no longer trust. So that's what walking through a portal or a doorway that conflict is presenting to you. This is what it looks like. I'm not telling you which response to choose. I'm asking you to notice which one you're already in, which one you normally gravitate towards, and whether it still matches who you're becoming. Will you keep participating in a reality that requires you to doubt your own perception and outsource your conscious to authority, or will you begin participating in a different standard, even if it costs you comfort, certainty, and belonging? All right, guys, don't let the news get you too disgusted that you feel like you have no agency. I hope this episode made you feel hopeful. Until next week, don't react, but respond with intention.